Hello, our topic is living among sleepers. And now I am prepared. I have fortified my spirit against the deceit of the world. Corpus Hermeticum, Book 13. What does it mean to be asleep, and what does it mean to be awake from a Hermetic perspective and a Gnostic one? In the secret book of John, Eve awakens Adam, not the other way around. And one of the things that Eve tells Adam by way of caution is beware of the deep sleep. What did she mean by that? For Gnostics and Hermetics in general, sleep was a sort of code word for unconsciousness, for going unconscious. So what does it mean in our day to be asleep and unconscious? And what can we do to wake up or stay awake? So overall, think of sleep in the Hermetic sense as a being absent, an absence of feeling, thought, perception, imagination, being absence, being tuned out. That's what they mean by sleep. So some examples of this. One is simply swallowing whatever the news or different authority figures have to say. My pastor says this, it must be true. My dad says this, or whatever. Now, Eric Fromm, the psychoanalyst, had a comment here. He says, if you ask the average person about, let's say, some current event that's going on, then they'll more or less tell you what they just read in the papers or these days just saw in the news or heard somebody talking about online. And that's not the problem. The problem is when people do that, when we do that, and we think that what we're actually repeating is our own opinion. We've actually forgotten where it came from. And that's a crucial absence. Instead of, well, the CNN version is blah, 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 we say, oh, what happened is. So we have substituted somebody else for our own decision making. Now, it's not to say that we can't be guided by the news. We pretty much have to be. Life is huge and complex, and we should know what's going on. We should be up on current events. But the point is, we need to be able to say our own opinion about it and where our opinions come from. So sleep in the sense of just swallowing whatever recognized authorities have to say, in our own little circle, in our own little bubble. This happens in religious circles sometimes too. It can happen in any circles, actually. And sometimes it takes the form of a kind of psychological regression where the authorities become parent figures and we just swallow whatever they say. And so instead of the wisdom of, for instance, Jesus saying, unless ye become as children, you will not enter the kingdom. The as gets taken out and then we become childlike. So that's a form of being asleep too, is taking the child position of, oh, I can't understand any of this. Let's let the experts figure it out. So another form of sleep has to do with what's often called positive thinking. Now it has its place, but sometimes positive thinking is a defense against really getting into whatever's surfacing for you emotionally. We were built with, a full range of feelings, and emotions are something like eyesight. You can't really select which ones you want and which you don't, because they're all in there and they all have energy. So when we only try to be positive and up, what we're actually doing is giving energy to the darkness and making it even darker. So the alternative, of course, is to have a full range of feelings. Another example of being asleep in our day would be the online popularity game. Not just using online platforms in order to sell a useful product or get a good message across or whatever, but actually getting obsessed with how you look online, how you act, and presenting a very precise image that you spend hours and hours of your time on. And then at some level, you become more and more aware that the image that you're projecting isn't really you. It's what Jungians would call your persona, your mask, And so if you're an influencer, you might have thousands or even millions of people believing in basically a false image of who you are. So that would be an example of being asleep. Also, there are certain canards that I like to refer to as psycho-truisms. And I may have to make a list at some point, but what I mean is psycho-truisms are these psychological truths that those of us who've had some kind of psychology education or background often believe without thinking. So I'll give you an example of three. You hear this a lot. Below anger is woundedness, right? And especially intense anger. So it's true that when people have anger issues and suffer from prolonged anger, there is wounding there. No doubt about that. But the way this is used is usually to bypass sitting with the anger or being present to somebody's angry feelings and trying to get to what's thought of as the more important wounding. As a matter of fact, in a lot of people, they have repressed their rage to such an extent that the rage is actually more unconscious than the wounding. There's a lot of angry people in the world who are happy to portray themselves as victims of some kind, and may even be accurate about why they've been hurt. But nevertheless, sometimes the anger is actually stuffed down harder than the wounding. So it's, again, necessary to see what's in there and sit with all of it. So that's one psycho-truism. Psycho-truism number two is in working with dreams. The usual understanding is that every image in a dream, every character, every event, every symbol is basically a part of us. And that's workable to an extent. But where the truism comes in is when people say, how you feel in the dream is key. So as a matter of fact, how you feel in the dream is a key to the fact that you're going to react in the dream the way you do in waking life. So if you're presented with something that's a little bit scary and past your safety zone in a dream, because let's say that that's the next step in your development, and you beat it down with a sword and you eviscerate whoever is presenting it to you, that's not a victory, that's a repression. So one thing that you can say about how you feel in a dream that's probably true most of the time, maybe even all the time, is that you're going to react the way you do during the day. So if you're repressing something or avoiding something or overpowering something during the day, it'll probably be reflected in your dreams at some point, if you're one of those people who remember their dreams. So I'm always, in tending my own dream, I'm always actually more interested in, I note how I feel if I'm a character in the dream, but I'm more interested in what the other figures have to say, because they are exactly who they are in symbolic form. So I tend to put a lot of attention on what they have to say. Third example, this comes from the field of Jungian psychology, and it's been referred to by different people as archetypal reductionism. And that means taking some experience and draining it of vitality by stamping an archetype on it. Oh, that's the great mother you're talking about. And when you make a move like that, if you haven't tended what the experience is, it kills it. So careful analysts don't do that. They know not to do that. But it does sometimes happen in circles of people who are interested in Jung's thought. So archetypal reductionism. So let's have a few more examples of sleep, and then let's talk about waking up. So there's the sleep of materialism, which is the idea that only what we can see and perceive and measure counts, and that there's no such thing as spirituality, it's just foolishness. The imagination is just a secondary capacity. We need to go by only facts, in which Henri Bortoft, who's a scholar of Goethe's natural science methods, refers to this as factism. But the sleep of materialism keeps the universe safe. It's rather nihilistic in some ways. And part of the lure of nihilism is that you're not really responsible for much except studying. You tend to be safe in the intellect, but the universe, because it's devoid of meaning, doesn't make any demands on you. And then one other example is the sleeping conscience. And so it's really amazing how many of us fall right in line when again, some authority, instead of simply telling us something that's not true or only partially true, is actually doing things, implementing procedures that hurt people, demonstrably hurt people, and we say nothing. We fall in line. Mark Twain had a term for that that's pretty brutal. He called it moral cowardice. So sociopaths and truly destructive people, I think, are relatively rare in a culture, the news notwithstanding. You know, the pyramid schemer and the crooked financier, the government official who launches endless wars or whatever it is, those people get a lot of attention, but my impression is that they're pretty rare. What's not rare are their enablers. The people who sit in those meetings and hear these awful plans. Yeah, we're going to put kids in cages or whatever it is we're going to do, and they say nothing. Or worse, they get behind it. So that's the sleep of the conscience. So let's talk about waking up. How do you wake up? And this is not comprehensive. This is just a few examples. So I want to mention a film that's worth seeing called The Truman Show. Pretty well-known film. Jim Carrey was the protagonist, and he stars somebody who grows up on basically a television stage without knowing it. And the whole thing is arranged to keep him pretty happy and satisfied and contented and unaware of the fact that there's a whole other world out there beyond the stage. And so in some ways, his process of waking up to where he really lives, you could think of as not the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, but something that's more like the Gnostic journey of going from sleep to wakefulness. And so a first step in this, which happens, there's a scene in which one of the light fixtures in the TV studios falls out of the fake sky and bang onto the ground right in front of him. And he says, "What's that?" And a friend of his, who's actually an extra, or an actor rather, says, "Oh, must have fallen out of a passing airplane." But it didn't, and it bothers him. And so things begin to accumulate that puncture his sense of unreality, his sleepiness. And at this point, I always think of something Albert Camus said: it happens that the stage settings collapse. So when uncanny things happen, to take note and to ask oneself, what does this really mean? And how is this disturbing my sleep and waking me up a little bit? What's the opportunity here for more wakefulness? Another tool of awakening is a simple sounding capacity that's very difficult to do. When your feelings are unpleasant, so angry, anxious, sad, depressed, whatever it is, being able to sit with them. And here's where psychology can be really helpful. There's all kinds of psychological tools for doing this. But being able to sit with your feelings when they feel horrible. I don't think there's one person in 1,000 who knows how to do that. Most of the time, our urge is to immediately start rearranging the outer world to make ourselves more comfortable. And if somebody's doing something that raises anxiety in us, usually our first move is to try to stop them. Back when I did couples therapy, I saw a lot of this too. Couples trying to control each other so they wouldn't have to sit with their own unpleasant feelings. So being able to do that and acquire psychic muscle is a very useful tool of awakening. The thing about feelings is when you sit with them, then they begin to move and they take care of themselves. We see this with happiness and joy. Nobody says, well, we better control our happiness and joy. Otherwise, we'll be happy and joyful forever. So why would we apply that to sadness or anger or anxiety? The feelings begin to move when you're present for them, fully present and awake. And then the energy that you use to suppress them becomes available to you for other activities. So try it yourself and see what happens. It's hard to do at first, but eventually the feelings themselves start to evolve. Now, there's an old piece of advice that Jesus gave that I'd like to mention, and I'll say right here very quickly, more on this in a later video, but the Gnostic Jesus is a bit different from the Jesus that a lot of us grew up with. If we were speaking in terms of archetypes, The Gnostic Jesus is more like a prophet or a wizard, or to use an overall term, a mage, a magical being, a magician in the archetypal sense. The Jesus that we grew up with, a lot of us, is more like a Dionysian figure, more like an example of the archetype of resurrection. So there's a death process, a going into the underworld, and then a rebirth. So in some ways, it would be almost accurate to say that the Jesus we're familiar with is an underworld figure. Be that as it may, there's some overlap between the two. And so in Matthew 10:16, Jesus gives his famous advice. And I'd like to remind you of this advice, those of you who've heard this before, because I think it's great advice for living among sleepers, among people who don't want to wake up. He said, be as cunning as serpents and as innocent as doves. So one way to understand this, and there are many, would be to acquire discernment, to acquire night vision, to not be fooled, to think about what you're seeing and hearing from people, to know the kinds of people who are not trustworthy and the kind that are trustworthy, to be careful about who you trust, and to be ethical yourself. So there's a way of waking up. Another example would be the call to conscience. So instead of being one of those people who sit in meetings and hear about coming atrocities and don't do anything, do something. Sometimes you can work behind the scenes. It doesn't have to be you heroically challenging somebody. Sometimes it can be a private conversation or a rallying of other people. Do you like this? Does this sit well with you? Maybe we should do something about it. There's lots of ways of handling it. One that is often counterproductive is to be too aggressive in how you handle it. But there are situations where somebody has to aggressively stand up and say that the emperor is naked. So the call to conscience. In an age that's dominated by really dirty politics and really dishonest public messages, refusing to be indifferent is radical. I'll say that again. Refusing to be indifferent is radical. So even if you don't openly protest things, refusing to not feel will be guidance for you in what you can do. Another suggestion for being awake is critical thinking. Mark Twain once said, when you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. I think that applies to minorities too. I think it applies to the smaller groups that we identify with. When you're all thinking the same thing, somebody's not thinking. So, if you find yourself going on about how aliens built the Egyptian pyramids or chemtrails or whatever it is, those are opportunities for you to step back and say, how do I really know this? Isn't this just conspiracy theory nonsense? Am I not just saying this because other people that I admire think it? And to investigate yourself, or to at least hold it in suspension, because we don't have time to investigate everything. Another suggestion for living among people who are sleeping, it's something that actually comes from Moby Dick. And one of the interesting things about that novel is Ahab, who's a kind of evil genius and extremely destructive, nevertheless goes in and out of these odd moments of clarity. It's very interesting. And in one of those moments, he makes a comment. He says, thrusted light is worse than presented pistols. When we shout at people to wake up and see what's going on, we lose them. So the suggestion here might be to live our wakefulness instead of preaching at people about it. Another suggestion, a final suggestion, and then I want to leave you with the last quotation. To be open to something with a capital S, to however you conceptualize it, fate or the collective unconscious or archetypal reality or just the uncanny. To be open to the idea that there are forces operating, maybe we could think of them as historical forces too, that don't necessarily fall under your control. And you have to be able to be sensitive to what's going on so that you can chart your course effectively. That does not mean giving yourself up to them or having a fatalistic attitude. The ancient word for that is hymarmene when it comes to astrology. So looking at transits and saying, I'm doomed. Pluto is angry at whatever right now, Mercury, or that's not the way to go. That too is a form of sleep. Determinism, fatalism, those are forms of sleep from a Hermetic perspective. But this is more about discerning the subtle currents of the time so that you can sail with them effectively. So those are some suggestions about being wakeful. And now a quote also from book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum. I wish that you had now stepped out of yourself, like those who dream and sleep and yet are awake. Thanks.